Thank you for being here. Gavin has asked me to host or the chair the more historically focused papers, short papers. My name is James Ungrianu. I teach at a small liberal arts college in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Cartridge College, and I'm a long way from home, but I very much believe in the mission of CSI, and I'm very glad to be here. Let me introduce our first short paper. The short paper is by Per Landgren. He is an associate member of the Faculty of History at the University of Oxford. In 2018, Landgren was awarded a doctorate in the history of science and ideas for a thesis entitled, very interesting title, The Aristotelian Concept of History, Theory of History in Renaissance Europe and Sweden. While at Oxford in several intervals and as a postdoctoral fellow at the Swedish Research Council, Landgren expanded his earlier research in conceptual history. This has led into new areas of Renaissance Aristotelianism, early modern epistemology, and theory of science. The title of his paper today is, it's up there on the origin of species, ideological roots of the species concept.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I will first just show you kind of a disposition that I will cover in 12 minutes. So I'll start in Uppsala. The young Linnaeus, he arrived in Amsterdam in 1735, armed with unpublished manuscripts. At the time, he was unknown. 3 years later, he had published his doctoral dissertation and an impressive part of his systematic works. His first edition, short edition of Systema Naturae, Fundamenta Botanica and Bibliotheca Botanica. Supported by influential Dutchmen, Linnaeus got his work published and spread to England, where he got a firm footing. Contributing to this was his own visit to England in 1736, where he met the president of the Royal Society, Hans Sloane. A few days later, he visited professor of botany at Oxford, Dillenius. His comparatively short stay in England was a success and forecasted a supportive reception of his taxonomical reformation. Natural theology and piety molded the minds of many of the intelligentsia at Oxbridge. Both the eminent English botanist John Ray and Linnaeus wrote to the honor of God. In 1691, Ray had published the wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation. Linnaeus expressed his natural theology clearly in his orations and in the prefaces to his great systematic works. The constancy and immutability of God was reflected in Ray's and Linnaeus' different taxonomies. Ray had in his Historia Plantarum insisted that the number of species was determined by God, since he, after his work on creation, rested from his work. That is, from his creation of new species. In Historia Plantarum, Ray had asserted the constancy of the number of species and in Systema Naturae, Linnaeus had declared that, quote, if we behold the works of God, it is more than sufficiently obvious to all that every animate being, quote, produce offspring like its parents, wherefore no new species can arise. Linnaeus asserted in his Fundamenta Botanica that we count as many species as there were different forms created at the beginning. Species and genera were clearly a result of God's creation. Variation was a product of culture. Species then, according to Linnaeus, are constantissimae because their generation is vera continuatio. Tracing back the formation of this species concept, we have to turn to the classical Greek and Roman world. Linnaeus worked as a natural scientist and Ray also, of course, in the Aristotelian tradition. When Aristotle classified animals, or when Theophrast, the great disciple of him, classified plants, they both used the concept genus, genos, and species, Greek eidos. The use of these two concepts had a technical distinction in the field of logic, and later they had developed a similar hierarchical distinction in biology. Behind the Aristotelian concept of eidos was the metaphysics of his master, Plato. In Plato's worldview, the concept of idea, Greek idea or eidos, had an essential and formative importance. There was a world of ideas separate from the world of senses. This world of ideas was for Plato the real world, and it consisted of perfect ideas of everything from qualities like beauty to living beings such as man. And we know, of course, that some theologians, church fathers like Augustine had the ideas in the, let's say, in the Godhead. But during a botanical excursion in 1742, a student from Uppsala discovered a strange flower, an unusual form of toad flax, later called Peloria. When Linnaeus was told about it, he was shocked, for this did not fit into his proposed natural system. He was sure that Peloria was a hybrid, which had been generated from Linaria vulgaris, but the differences in its flower were of such significance that he felt obliged to create a new genus and put it into a class other than that of its only known parent species. His belief in the fixity of species was challenged, and Linnaeus soon felt forced to reconsider his earlier beliefs in footnotes in new editions of his works. Linnaeus and his disciple Daniel Rudberg made the discovery public in their dissertation De Peloria, 1744. God had created genera, and species were treated now as varieties. More than 100 years later, Charles Lyell, in a letter to the Swedish professor of paleontology Sven Löfven, expressed his thankfulness at having been informed about the species concept of Linnaeus. During a visit to the Lyells in London earlier the same year, Löfven had been asked about Linnaeus' view on the nature and origin of species. Löfven had referred to something about the early opinions of his great countryman, adding also that Linnaeus later speculated, even labeling some species of plants temporis filia, daughters of time. Back home in Stockholm, however, Löfven prepared a more detailed answer. He consulted the Uppsala botanist Elias Fries, who according to Löfven was more familiar with the botanical works and the spirit of Linnaeus than any man then living. Lyell, he was happy to receive the letter just in time for the printing of his second volume of the 10th edition of his Principles of Geology. Obviously, Lyell had for a long time entertained a misunderstanding about Linnaeus' later views on the species question, and in passing, Lyell mentioned in his reply to Löfven that his friend, and I'm forgetting to use this, but here we have the letter it's in Stockholm, where he, his friend, quote, "My friend Charles Darwin was a good deal surprised," end of quote, when he in turn was told that Linnaeus had modified his views. Although the immutability position in biology was the officially received and accepted view in Great Britain and in the world, in Europe, in the time of Darwin, there were different views on the scope and limit of species. Disregarding hybridization, the majority of the naturalists believed that species always produced offspring according to its own kind. But assessing the border between species on the one hand and subspecies and varieties on the other was a tricky business and always open to criticism. The problem was to define the limits between the systematic categories. However, a growing number of scientists meant that their experiences of reality could not be harmonized with a rigid immutability stance. Furthermore, German natural philosophy, transcendental morphology, and the new science of comparative anatomy embodied vast historical speculations on archetypes and evolution in the original sense of the word, which makes Darwin's image of his colleagues in the origin, for example, as creationists in the sense of fixity of species, perhaps rhetorical. The leading paleontologist, for instance, here in England, Richard Owen, was furious. In 1915, the Dutch professor Koolbrugge published an animated article in which he asserted that 87 of Darwin's contemporary scientists believed in the variability of species to such an extent that the author, by quoting Darwin himself from his autobiography, accused Darwin of being unaware of the positions of his colleagues and incapable of mastering foreign languages. To this, Koolbrugge added a long list of enthusiasts and scholars, including Lamarckists, mainly from the previous century, who believed in a fantastic possibility of variation, and another list of more sober scholars who believed in speciation by hybridization. For instance, Linné, Gmelin, Kohlreuter, and Adamson. Of Darwin's contemporaries, some seemingly did partake in a gentleman's agreement not to discuss the issue at all in public. After all, according to Newton and the Newtonian tradition, with great followers like Herschel and Whewell, it was judged to be more a question of philosophy than of science, in the modern sense of the words. The standard application of old scientific Aristotelian view, which the young Linnaeus as well as the young Darwin had, I did something with my hand, as well as the young Darwin had endorsed, and which had been married to the biblical interpretation of the creation account long before, did little by little lose its intellectual and scientific credibility. There were, however, many able defenders of a more sophisticated application of the old immutability stance, such as the Cambridge-educated entomologist Thomas Vernon Wollaston, if that was the correct pronunciation, who 3 years before The Origin was published had written the work on the variation of species. Darwin had seen Wollaston as a potential convert, but was badly mistaken. In a review of The Origin in 1860, in Annals of Magazine of Natural History, Wollaston thought that Darwin had pressed his theory too far. Varieties were, quote, at times mistaken by naturalists for true species, end of quote. And that was, quote, surely no argument against the genuineness of the latter. It merely shows, Wollaston continued, the imperfection of our limited judgment and that the best observers are liable to err, and either not to catch the true characters of species intuitively, which in point of fact they could scarcely be expected to do, or else to assign at times undue importance to differences, which they may afterwards detect not to be in reality specific. For Wollaston and many others, there were fixed, specific bounds and a legitimate variation within them. Not very surprisingly, Darwin himself did not integrate discoveries and new facts in the still dominating theistic worldview. Instead, he quite early in his life turned from that extreme form of idealistic creationism, idealistic from Plato then, which the great taxonomist Linnaeus had adjusted as early as 1742, when it seemingly clashed with empirical data. This intellectual shift of metaphysical paradigms, and I tend to forget these things, but perhaps we can skip them, but This intellectual shift of the metaphysical paradigm for science suggests quite convincingly that Darwin's early view on creation was more culturally determined than personally integrated. For Linnaeus, the Christian worldview directed his interpretation of scientific activity. For Darwin, the Christian worldview was never really his own. The views of the mature Linnaeus even took Darwin by surprise in 1867. Obviously, he had always looked upon the Swedish botanist as a stalwart upholder of the fixity of species and never thought of the possibility of a new, in that time, reasonable synthesis within the framework of theistic creation. Thank you.
5 minutes of questions. Questions? Over there, towards the back.
Hello. As far as I understand it, at the end of Linnaeus's life, he made the decision that the unit of creation was the order, so the order of plant species. That's his sort of final conclusion. And what I wanted to say is that the classification of plants and animals is very important to the theory that you have, because each classification actually demonstrates the theory that you hold to, and many facts are actually theory generated. So in our present classification system, it's very, for animals, it's very mammal heavy in that orders correspond to a totally different thing than when you look at invertebrates. Invertebrates are placed in different phyla, while mammals are placed in different orders. And for plants itself, I mean, Stephen Jay Gould said that no new classes of plants have ever evolved, and that's only because they're named as divisions rather than phyla and classes. So the classification system that we currently have is not necessarily helping us to understand the questions.
Yeah, well, I'm not taking a stand in modern botany or taxonomy. I'm just trying to go back in time and see what were they talking about, what was the discussion, and how did Linnaeus react when he met reality according to his interpretation, and how did Darwin react. So it's good to know what happens now, but that's not my business. Really.
Questions? Over here in front.
I think this is a bit of an innocent question coming from a younger scientist, but how does understanding the history of the origins of species help us today as Christian scientists?
Well, that's an interesting question, really. I mean, all questions here are interesting, but I think that at least what I'm trying to do as a historian of science is that I try to come into their, at least their lives, or at least their age, and see, not judge them from what we know now, but to see why they developed thinking and views as they did. For instance, then, why Linnaeus stayed to be a creationist in the wide sense of the word. I would like to use creatio. That's, you know, that's the biblical word for what God did. So when we say creationist now and think upon a special kind of interpretation, that's one thing. So it could help us to see how perhaps I'm idealizing the picture of Linné, but how many of the, let's say, our Christian brothers reacted to Darwin? And I can see that, at least I think that Darwin, he belonged, to a minority view, so he had to have strategies not to be hanged like Chambers 20, 30 years before in the 40s. In a way, that's the position that Christians have now. That we are, in a sense, in a minority in our secular countries, so we could learn from that. And in that respect, I don't think Darwin was an example, good example, so to speak.
One more question.
Just thinking of Darwin and his Baconian method of induction, is there evidence that Darwin was consciously self-aware of applying a Baconian methodology, or do you think he just absorbed it from the current philosophy of his day?
Well, I think he definitely was a Baconian, so to speak, when he did his taxonomy. But when he speculated, in the modern sense of that word, speculated on how all things came to be and about creation and evolution, I think he didn't act as a Baconian. I think that Adam Sedgwick in his criticism was right, that this wasn't inductivism or inductive work at all. As you perhaps all know, Thomas Henry Huxley's criticism to Darwin was that he didn't have a single proof of mutation, of a transmutation, of a new species. And that was, of course, a problem. But the speculations in the origin were quite fantastic. You remember on page 186, I think, Hearn reported about the black bear, and the black bear, if they had no competition on eating the insects and so on, I can see no difficulty in, Darwin wrote, that the bear became more and more aquacious and become a whale. And that wasn't induction. That was pure speculation, fantastic speculation. So they took it away from the first edition. So it didn't come up in the second, third, and fourth, and fifth edition.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.